a pleasure to welcome you today to this event to discuss our Brookings colleague Shadi Hamid's new book entitled Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World. For today's event, our author Shadi Hamid will open by delivering remarks about his book's main thesis, followed by responses from MEI's Hassan Mneimneh and George Washington University's Nathan Brown. After that, our speakers will engage in a discussion on stage, and the final 20 minutes or 25 minutes will be reserved for audience Q&A. The event will close at 1:30 p.m. Copies of the book will be available for purchase and signing after the event. We're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Sumaya Hamdani of George Mason University, who has graciously agreed to moderate this discussion. And before introducing her, I want to mention an event we're having next week, to put that on your calendar if you can. We will be hosting our friends from the Syrian American Medical Society for a launch of their recent report documenting the public health effects caused by the siege of the Syrian town of Madaya. The report examines the dire health conditions in the besieged town, and offers recommendations for humanitarian relief delivery. The event will be next Wednesday at noon at the Middle East Institute on N Street, just a block from here. We hope you can join us. Please check our website for details and to sign up if you wish. Now let me introduce our moderator, Dr. Sumaya Hamdani, who in turn will introduce our panelists and lead today's event. Dr. Hamdani is an associate professor of world history at George Mason University. She's an expert in the field of Islamic history, having earned her PhD from Princeton University with a particular focus on Shi'i thought and the role of women in Islam. She founded the Islamic Studies program at George Mason University and served as the program's director from 2003 to 2008. Her book, Between Revolution and State, The Construction of Fatimid Legitimacy, examines the development of legal and historical literature by the Ismaili Shi'i Fatimid state. Dr. Hamdani has served on advisory boards of the Middle East Studies Association, the American Institute of Yemeni Studies, and the North American Association of Islamic and Muslim Studies. Her expertise in Islamic history and thought will help guide us through what is sure to be a compelling discussion this afternoon. We're pleased to have this distinguished panel with us today. And without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Sumaya.
Thank you. My great pleasure and a wonderful opportunity to be here, to be brought out of the medieval and into the modern period, and to have a chance to dialogue with colleagues and those of you in the audience about this very provocative book. I will be very pleased to introduce the speaker and author of today's book under discussion, Dr. Shadi Hamid. Shadi Hamid is a senior fellow in the project on U.S. relations with the Islamic world in the Center for Middle East Policy, and the author of the new book, which you have seen and some of you have in possession, Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World. His previous book, Temptations of Power, Islamists and Illiberal Democracy in a New Middle East, published by Oxford University Press in 2014, was named a Foreign Affairs Best Book of 2014. Shadi has served as Director of Research at the Brookings Doha Center until January 2014. Prior to joining Brookings, he was Director of Research at the Project on Middle East Democracy, POMED, and a Hewlett Fellow at Stanford University Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law. Shadi is a contributing writer for The Atlantic and the Vice Chair of POMED's Board of Directors. Please welcome Dr. Shadi Hamid.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Paul and Sumaya, for the kind introductions. Thank you to the Middle East Institute for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you today. So I'll get right into the argument. So, of course, all religions are unique. That should go without saying. but they're not all unique in the same way. And one of my main arguments, and probably the most controversial, is that Islam is in fact exceptional, and exceptional in a particular way that still has meaning 14 centuries after its founding. So Islam is exceptional in how it relates to law, politics, and governance. And what that means, and I'll just kind of flesh it out a little bit, is that in both theory and practice, Islam has proven to be resistant to secularization. And I would argue, for the foreseeable future and probably for the rest of my life, it will continue to be resistant to secularization. Now, this is the kind of argument that can be easily misconstrued. So in some ways, I'm actually slightly uncomfortable with my own conclusions. And I'm aware that anti-Muslim bigots can misuse an argument like this for purposes that I personally don't agree with. And that's already happened. So the book's been out for a little while now, and I've seen that happen, and it concerns me. So with that in mind, I'll try to be as clear as I can about the argument so that it's not misconstrued. And of course, I'm here with the Middle East Institute crowd, so I doubt that would happen. All of you are very smart. So, so I want to emphasize that Islam's outsized role in public life is neither good or bad from my perspective. It just is. It's a reality. And it can be good in some contexts, and it can be bad in other contexts. So we have to look very specifically at how Islam manifests itself in everyday politics in any number of countries across the globe. And that's going to differ, of course, from one country to another. And I wanted to emphasize this because I feel like there are certain starting assumptions in our American or even Western debate about Islam and its role in politics that makes me uncomfortable. I think they're problematic starting assumptions. The first is that this implicit assumption, sometimes it's more explicit, that the less religion you have, the better. So the kind of goal there is to minimize Islam's role in public life, and it's not said explicitly usually, but that's the basic hope, that over time Muslims will become like everyone else, or in particular, like the Christian West, or like Americans, Europeans, and so on. The second implicit, and actually often more times explicit assumption, is that Muslims will, in due time, become liberals, and it's just a matter of time. And again, it kind of fits into this, I think, sometimes patronizing approach to the issue that, hey, we Christians in the West, we went through our own Reformation. We had hundreds of years of wars and violence and all of that. Don't worry, you Muslims will get there too. Just be patient. You guys have to get better at it, and you'll get there eventually, like everyone else does. And even if we acknowledge that Muslims won't necessarily, writ large, embrace liberalism. So I'm talking here about Muslim-majority countries in the Middle East and beyond, South and Southeast Asia, etc., that even if Muslims won't accept liberalism, the presumption is that they should accept it. So it becomes a normative argument about what things should be like, irrespective of what the reality is. So now let me just kind of go into two reasons or two sources of Islam's exceptionalism. Now, there are many more reasons and factors that I discuss in the book, but we don't have much time, so I'll just focus on two, which I think are probably most interesting for our discussion. The first is the founding moment. We have to go back 14 centuries and look at Prophet Muhammad's role as a prophet, but also as much more than a prophet. So unlike Jesus, who was a dissident against a reigning state, Jesus never was in a position to govern. So it's not surprising that the New Testament doesn't have a lot to say about public law and governance, because Jesus was never in the position to really contend with those issues. Prophet Muhammad, on the other hand, was not just a prophet, he was also a head of state. And not just a head of state, but also a state builder. And I want to emphasize the state builder part in particular. And So in this respect, the religious and political functions are intertwined in the person of Prophet Muhammad. And this has, I would argue, major implications even today. So the argument here is that founding moments do in fact matter. Muslims can't escape their, Muslims aren't bound to their founding moment, right? No one is bound to their founding moment, but no one can fully escape their founding moment either. Just like Christians, at least if you're a practicing Christian, you believe in Christ. And that Christ died for your sins and so on. That's not something you can really change, at least from a theological standpoint. You can make a similar argument about the prophet's role. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have Muslim reformers who argue for more secularism, however you want to define secularism. And there have been many Muslim reformers who have called for at least some separation of religion from politics, or at least to de-emphasize Islam's role in public life. And I think we'll continue to have these oftentimes very brave reformers for decades to come. But they have trouble making their argument, and their arguments have trouble gaining mass traction in much of the Muslim world, because essentially they have to argue or explain away the prophetic model. It can be done, but it's a somewhat challenging hermeneutical argument. You have to sort of get into complex reinterpretation. I discussed some of those approaches. They haven't so far, though, gained much traction in many of the countries that I think we focus on. So that is something we have to keep in mind going forward. And I should also say that, so a believer would say that it couldn't be otherwise. So if you're a Muslim believer, you believe in Islamic theology, you would say that Prophet Muhammad becoming both a politician and a prophet was part of God's plan. But if you're coming at it from an outside analytical perspective, we could say that this is in some ways an accident of history. So I'm not making an essentialist argument, I'm actually making more of a historical argument. So let's imagine an alternative parallel universe where Prophet Muhammad wasn't able to capture and hold territory. So if he wasn't ever put in a position to govern, then presumably the Quran wouldn't have as much to say about governance, right? So we can sort of imagine these sort of counterfactual trajectories, and then we can ask the question, what if Prophet Muhammad had lost certain early battles and so on? Obviously, from a Muslim theological perspective, that's not something that's really discussed because, again, it was God's plan. The second factor I'll mention before I close up is Quranic inerrancy. So how Muslims view the Quran is not equivalent to even how right-wing evangelicals view the Bible. So evangelicals would say that the Bible is the Word of God. Muslims would say, however, that not only is the Quran the Word of God, but it is God's actual speech. So it's a level beyond. So in other words, the idea there is that every letter and word is directly from God. There is no human interaction. There is no human mediation. However, with the Bible, Christian evangelicals today will quite readily acknowledge that there is some human role in the writing of various parts of the Bible. Of course, they would still consider it to be the Word of God and that it's free from falsehood, but that doesn't mean there's a human role. So that's an important difference as well. Now, how does Islam's exceptionalism manifest itself in everyday politics today, if you accept my premise? So, okay, I'll have to rush this. Yeah. So if we want to understand the rise of ISIS, the demise of the Arab Spring, and so on, we can talk about different dates. I think one date that's important that doesn't get talked about as much is 1924, the date of the formal abolition of the last caliphate. And ever since then, there has been a struggle to establish a legitimate political order in the Middle East. And I would argue that at the center of that struggle are a set of unresolved questions about Islam's relationship to the state. And they remain unresolved, and they will probably stay unresolved to one degree or another for decades to come. And that's part of the challenge here, is that pre-modern Islamic law wasn't designed for the modern era, a modern era of nation states. So the question that I think a lot of Islamists and others who want Islam to play some role in public life, and of course there's a lot of disagreements there, the challenge there is how do you actually make something that was designed for the pre-modern era relevant and applicable and resonant in today's politics? And how do you square that circle? And I would argue that to some extent you can't really square the circle, and that's part of why we're seeing instability and violence in the Middle East today. Now, I'll just end with maybe a path. So if you take my premise that we have these unresolved divides, very quickly I'll mention a couple ways of looking at it going forward and try to end on a positive note, is that the question for me is not how to minimize Islam's role in public life, because as I said, that's not realistic. The challenge is how to normalize Islam's role in public life. And this is where I think Islamist parties, and we can talk more about those different parties later, have actually had an inherently polarizing effect, because they have essentially defined themselves in opposition to the other. It only makes sense to be an Islamist in opposition to something else. So religion comes to be seen as the province of one party instead of something that's part of a broader conservative consensus. So the question is how to make Islam's role in public life less polarizing. And in the book, I talk about a number of different approaches. One that I think is worth mentioning here as I close are two, I shouldn't say model, because I don't want to jinx countries that are actually doing pretty well. Remember when we called Turkey the Turkish model, and we saw how that went. So how about I'll use a different word. I won't say model, I'll just say template. And I think Indonesia... Indonesia and Malaysia are interesting cases here, because Islam does actually play an outsized role in public life. We do see the implementation of Sharia law on the local level in more conservative regions of Indonesia. But it's actually not just Islamists who do that. It's also ostensibly secular parties that seem to be quite comfortable with this role for Islam and Islamic law. So it's not just Islamists who are doing Islamism in those cases, and you can actually have Islamism without Islamists. So I'll close there and look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce a friend and esteemed scholar, Hassan Mneimneh, who is a specialist in Middle East and North Africa and wider Islamic world. His particular emphasis in studying these regions has been on radicalism and factionalism. Hassan is a non-resident scholar at the MEI, I should have pointed out at first. Hassan has written on political, cultural, historical, and intellectual questions concerning the Arab and Muslim worlds. He's a regular contributor to the pan-Arab newspaper Al-Hayat and is currently affiliated with Middle East Alternatives and Fikra Forum. His previous affiliations include the German Marshall Fund, the Hudson Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, and the Iraq Memory Foundation. Please welcome Hassan. Dr. Mneimneh.
As Shadi has properly noted, there used to be actually two crowds that propose and actually advocates for the notion of Islamic exceptionalism. One was the one that Shadi alluded to, which is the Islamophobes. The other crowds used to be the Islam supremacists, al-Baghdadi, al-Adnani, the others. My concern is not that Shadi is now actually initiating a third crowd, but he's also, a crowd of, if you'd like, more mainline, more mainstream intellectuals who look at the matter and get to the same conclusions, and therefore feed into these two mutually reinforcing crowds. But also that what we have is effectively a case of a stipulation rather than a demonstration. I'll try to deal with it. Let me just start by saying a couple of words about the book. The book is actually 4 case studies, book ended by 2 reflection pieces. The case studies in question are about Egypt, Tunisia, and Turkey, and they are excellent because they are firsthand They are the reflections of someone who not only tried to deal with the events, but actually lived the events. I urge you to read the book, in particular for these 3 case studies. The 4th case study is about the Islamic State. I have issues with it. I leave it to the side. We can get to it. It is not important. The two book ends in question. One has to do with background, which is at the beginning, and I have the most disagreement with it. I'll get to it. And the other has to do with policy, which I would say what Shadi does in that book end when he's reflecting on the likes of people who would argue, for example, that Islam is not compatible with democracy, etc. He does make genuine, actually solid, robust contributions about what we should be talking about, what we should be discussing. My concern is that if you'd like, the beauty of what I've just described gives credibility to the first part, which is the background, which I disagree with deeply. And I think it's actually, I would propose that it's even a dangerous argument to make. Let me just, for the purpose of brevity, because we don't have a lot of time to debate it at length, take the 2 points that Shadi mentioned, the founding moment and the inerrancy of the Quran. And let's talk about them. With regard to the founding moment, let me remind you of something that's actually extremely interesting. Up until the 19th century, the literacy in all of the Islamic world did not exceed the low single digits % of the total population. We're talking about 1 to 3% at best. Of those, only a few, meaning actually a minority, would have placed themselves squarely within the tradition that is variably referred to as Ahl al-Hadith and later on as the Salafist and today modern Salafism. The majority of the others actually would have placed themselves within more, if you'd like, either Kalam schools that today are defunct, or for that matter, ecstatic trends that today are in the retreat and often accused of not being even Islam. Okay? Why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this to underline the fact that there has been, let's call it an unholy alliance, between scholarship that has decided to favor the output of that 1%, that slight slither, and treat it as if it is effectively our sole window to the legacy of Islam. That's a legacy of 1,400 years that spans all over the globe, that is full of all sorts of manifestations of the religious, including syncretism, which we have basically tossed away. And we have decided to treat that scholastic legacy, that thin scholastic legacy, as true Islam. Now, Shadi is trying to take the position that let me not be judgmental about it, let me look at it historically. What he's not doing is underlining the fact that we know very little about it. Think about the whole debate about the historical Jesus and how much it has reformed Christianity altogether. Think about the fact that you have today Christians, genuine Christians, who actually doubt the historicity of most of what the Jesus episode was. Let me ask you, where is the equivalent in the Islamic world? It's not there for reasons that have to do with the Muslim world, but also that has to do with the Western scholarship that had accepted at face value the story told by that thin slither of scholars within scholasticism that we have today. The founding moment that Shadi talks about is not true. The founding moment is multiple. Maybe, according to some, according to those scholars who in the 2nd and 3rd century of Islamic history, and at the foundation of the Abbasid Empire, decided to project into the founding moment issues of religion and state, etc. Maybe for them, what Shadi has described makes sense. For the overwhelming majority of Muslims who have lived then and up until very recently, actually, that founding moment is not that way at all. It was a communion with the divine. It was all sorts of other approaches to religion. And therefore, to speak about the founding moment with that certainty and therefore impose on the whole world of Islam that the rigidity of that founding moment is a triumph for Islamism. Because exactly this is what Islamism has been trying to do to Islam. And I'm making here a distinction between Islam, which is by necessity plural, and varied throughout time, throughout history, and Islamism, which is actually an outgrowth of scholasticism, but now imbued with politics, if you'd like, and which try to frame Islam as a positive reality. Quranic inerrancy. Indeed, what he described about the Quran is what most Muslims today and throughout history would tell you. The Quran is the word of God. But it is not an unbound word of God. There is many exegetical tools that you use in order to rephrase the Quran. Is the Quranic commandment applicable to all, to a few, to one, or not at all? No agreement on that. Is it allegorical or is it literal? No agreement on that. Scholars have a lot to deal with, but much more important than scholars, because it's not about scholars. Common Muslims have had very varied understandings of what the inerrancy of the Quran is. What the book omits, and I'd like to underline that, is that the period in which the Muslim Brotherhood and Nahda and the AKP and all Islamism was brewing, it was part and parcel of a Muslim context that was brewing also with nationalism, with ideas of universal values, with ideas of leftist values. All of this is absent from the book. I mean, as if the Muslim Brotherhood existed in a vacuum. The Islamization, the project, the Mashru' al-Islami, that the Muslim Brotherhood tried to advance is exactly the new man of the communists, not exactly in terms of the content, but it's in the same drive. It has to be viewed in the same context, and therefore, when it's absent, we end up with the false impression that these people who are Muslims are guided, managed, shaped only by Islam. And therefore, an Islam that actually we have decided for them what it is, because we've decided that the texts give us this version of Islam. In other words, what I would urge you to do in terms of while reading the very important contribution to the debate that Shadi has offered is to keep in mind that it's part of the picture, it's not the whole picture. Thank you.
Well, we have the beginnings of a discussion. And now, let's see what Dr. Nathan Brown will contribute to that discussion. Dr. Brown, or Nathan, if I may, is professor and director of the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Nathan received his BA in political science from the University of Chicago and his MA and PhD in politics and Near Eastern studies, thank you, from Princeton. Just a little solidarity, fist pump. He teaches courses on Middle Eastern politics and, as well as more general courses on comparative politics and international relations. Dr. Brown has been president of the Middle East Studies Association and in the years 2013 to 2015, and has also been named a Guggenheim Fellow, a Carnegie Scholar, and a Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. In addition to his academic work, Nathan serves on the Middle East and North Africa Advisory Committee for Human Rights Watch and the Board of Trustees at the AUC, another point of commonality. He has previously served as an advisor for the committee drafting the Palestinian Constitution, USAID, and the United Nations Development Program, and several NGOs. Please welcome Dr. Nathan Brown.
Thank you very much. Short version of my remarks would be, yeah, what he said. But then my remarks would be shorter than the introduction. So I'll elaborate a little bit.
Who's the he in this case?
You. In terms of what Shadi said, kind of what he says in the middle of the book, not what he says at the beginning and the end. I mean, my take is actually fairly similar. I think Shadi tries to do two things in this book. One is to show an essential difference between Islam and liberal approaches, focusing on law, on individual autonomy, on secularism and the like, and second, to show various manifestations of this essential difference in the modern era. And I think these things are in tension with each other. And the first is based on a truth, but not a very helpful one. And I say based on, but the second is really, really good. And that's the middle of the book. And that's where he goes through the specific countries and the specific movements and so on. And the portraits that emerge from those chapters are empathetic without being sympathetic. That is to say, I get some of these movements are ones that I have studied myself, some are not. The ones that I've studied myself, I said, yes, he gets them. He gets how the world looks from them without being sucked in. In some ways, he's actually fairly critical. And I mean, he's a very good listener. He's a great analyst. He gets their dynamism. He gets their blind spots. I think if for some reason, Brookings decided they were through with you, you could probably do very, very well as like a personal therapist, because you get how they feel, okay? And I just imagine Shadi in offices and living rooms throughout the regions, I mean, and that's a great method for understanding a family of approaches that sometimes throw outside observers for a loop. And in some ways, the movements that he's dealing with, and he makes this point, are very, very modern movements. And they're not just modern movements in the sense of the last century or so. He's confronting them at a time, I think, when they're dealing with, in some ways, reacting to what I would say very, very briefly would be the failure of kind of the mainstream Islamist political project. And they're grappling with that in a bunch of different ways. And that's really what he shows. That is, I think, a little bit in tension with this idea of showing what Islam essentially is. That there's some essential core to Islam since its founding, which will just place harsh limits on what you're capable of doing, what arguments you can make within an Islamic framework. There is an underlying essentialism in the first part and the last part of the book. Now, for those of you who are from an academic setting, you know that when I use the word essentialist, it's probably the heart. I mean, I could question his parents' virtue. That would be okay. When you use the word essentialist in an academic setting, those are really fighting words. So, but I'm happy to see that Shadi's sitting in his chair because we're in a genteel think tank setting rather than a university seminar room. Why do I say it's essentialist? Because what he says is that there's some real essential core to Islam. And I think he bases this on some things that make an awful lot of sense and make an awful lot of sense to an awful lot of Muslims. There's ways in which, for instance, the Islamic legal tradition, it figures more prominently historically than it does for other religions. But to me, these are modal differences, and they sometimes are modal differences that tell us an awful lot less than we think that they do. If I were to read another recent book that came out, I think, last year, Shadi Hamid's book, What is Islam? Next to Shadi's, I would say, oh, well, that's okay. They're talking about two completely different religions. And what he's talking about was in that book is, in essence, the varieties of forms in which the Islamic religion, Islamic piety can be expressed. And this is where I get into the longer version of, yes, what he said. Even if we were to focus on law, what law is has in a sense, has fundamentally changed in some ways. What it is that Muslims understand law, the specific rulings, the way in which it is to be used, and so on. If you take a look, at least in the Arab world today, the area of law which is most which is probably most informed by Islamic legal thinking and practice, and which is viewed as most essential, is, of course, personal status law. Very few countries would, or very few regimes would play with personal status law without realizing that they're getting into dangerous religious territory. So it's viewed as the essence of Islamic law as it is practiced by Middle Eastern states today, and as a category of law that doesn't exist in classical Islamic law. It's not that the legal ideas aren't there, but this idea that there's a separate, distinct body of something called personal status law is a 19th century invention. So there's ways in which, if we look at this as historically minded people, the essential difference of Islam, even if it's there, doesn't tell us very much. And let's look at the other side of the equation: the essential Islamic world versus a liberal secular West. Well, yes, I mean, I think there are, again, some modal differences, but much less extreme than you might think. I often said, when the Muslim Brotherhood was in power in Egypt, when I took a look at their platform, I said, I think I understand what they want. They want something that looks a little bit like the America my dad was born into, that banned alcohol, that banned commerce on Sunday. When the Muslim Brotherhood was confronted with the question, could a woman or a non-Muslim become elected president? First they said no, and then they kind of backtracked. And the reasoning was clear. Well, no one's going to get elected who's a woman or a Christian anyway, so why? We don't have to actually put it in law. The America my dad was born into had just given women the right to vote, and for a non-church-going Christian to be elected president would have been unthinkable. These differences are, as I say, an awful lot more recent. Now, I'm not going to argue that they don't exist. It is, for instance, impossible, I think, to imagine an American political party, say, as this is a quotation taken from a speech by Mohammed Morsi, man-made law must be consistent with God-given natural rights. If God-given natural inalienable rights come into conflict with government, court, or human-granted rights, God-given natural inalienable rights always prevail. Wait, I'm sorry, my note cards got mixed up. That's actually not from Mohammed Morsi. That's from the Republican Party platform of 2016. Word for word. So the differences are there, and they're real. And they're ones, I think, that have to be managed the way that Shadi suggests. And I think he gives us great ways for understanding them in their particularities. But to understand these as essential differences is one that, as I say, is based on some truth, but ultimately unhelpful truth. Thank you.
Now I'm going to have to time myself. Or maybe someone can be in charge of giving me the napkin. I'm with him, wanted to say, with my fellow panelists and with Shadi. In the sense, I'm with Shadi because I feel the consternation, I feel the pain. Things went sour after 2011, and Islam is looking very messy and very messily involved in the events in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. So I feel the sense of, bewilderment and intrigue and the desire to sort of come to some grips or some conclusions about what happened, what went wrong, to paraphrase someone, that I think in some ways, in Shadi's attempt to answer what happened after 2011, Shadi is kind of curiously challenging, which goes to what my colleague Nathan was saying about the sort of tendency to essentialize Islam and to use some very Orientalist kind of assumptions in looking at what is distinct about Islam. So Shadi's, I'm going to speak as a medievalist in the first case, and I would like to agree with Hassan on the points that he made about the sort of historical issues that Hassan had with the introductory chapters of Shadi's book. Not only was there no clear-cut understanding of the foundational moment of Islam, not only was there vigorous debate at the time of the Prophet's death about what should happen after his death, not only did it result in a civil war, and not only did the turbulence and debates about what should happen after the Prophet's death in terms of politics continue until the time of the Mehna in the Abbasid period, but the end result of all of that was the separation of church and state. That is an undeniable, undisputable fact in Islam. There was never a consensus on the caliphate. And in the end, after about 2 centuries or so of development and debate, Islam came to the conclusion, or Muslims came to the conclusion, that separation of church and state was necessary. This is the raison d'etre for the ulama. This is the raison d'etre for Sharia. The caliphate quickly became a symbolic mantle, and it was a football that was tossed around by various dynasties in their bid to give themselves the veneer of something other than just naked power. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The other thing, as a historian, that I would like to weigh in with is that there is something about the kind of narrative about Islam that you hear coming out of Salafism today or the Muslim Brotherhood today that really kind of eerily echoes the nationalist, the secular nationalist narratives that have been part of the public education system throughout the Islamic world. Nation states and modernizing states in the 19th century and nation states in the early 20th century in the Islamic world, especially in the Arab world, secularized the sacred history of Islam, reduced it to episodes of glory and triumph, and presented those as the basis for an authentic national identity. They introduced this idea of authenticity as the coin and currency of citizenship and belonging, and that became the football that was debated between the secular nationalists and the Islamists, both of whom ultimately are going at each other and arguing over who is the more authentic citizen. I was also wondering and hoping to hear from Shadi a little bit something about some of the terms and concepts that he engaged with, concepts like modernity, concepts like the state and its governmentality, concepts also like nationalism. When you sort of suggest that there is some kind of interaction, connection, tension between religion on the one hand and things, for example, like, citizenship and, belonging to states, I think it's necessary to delve and to talk a little bit about what exactly you mean. What exactly do you mean by secular? How exactly do you, and when exactly would you put the modern era? To what extent is the state something that is different in the modern period than it was in the pre-modern period? And to what extent does that then therefore make Muslims today or Islam exceptional in its relationship to all of these things? Thank you. I think we're having a discussion amongst ourselves, and then in all of 10 minutes, we'd like to open the floor to, or maybe more, 20 minutes.
I start off by responding to some of the...
I would like to invite Shadi to the podium or to his chair to respond to.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So just to address some of the points, and then hopefully we can have more of a discussion. So obviously I couldn't cover everything in 10 minutes. So obviously some of it was oversimplified, but I really want to emphasize what I ended with, that Islamism is a modern phenomenon. So Islamism couldn't have existed 4 centuries ago, and that's something that I discuss at some length, that Islam was the natural order of things. It wasn't questioned in the sense of offering an overarching moral, religious, and legal architecture. And I should emphasize that within that, you have incredible diversity. So my argument is not an argument against diversity within Islam. It's an argument for understanding that each religion has boundaries. Religions can't be anything we want them to be. So I think that's something that a lot of us are uncomfortable with actually acknowledging. Islam can't be anything we want it to be. It is something, and there are creedal requirements and there are boundaries. For example, again, the creedal requirement that the Quran is not just the word of God, but God's actual speech. Now, you could probably pick 1 or 2 figures from the Mu'tazilite era who maybe had a very interesting perspective on whether the Quran is created or uncreated. There are philosophical distinctions, but by and large, that creedal requirement has generally not been questioned. It would be akin to questioning whether Christ existed. You can't be a Christian theologically if you don't believe in Christ. If you think he was just a man, you can't actually be theologically Christian either in the Protestant. I'll just
Quran
finish.
doesn't say anything about politics, though.
No, it actually does. It does. But in any case, I really want to. I am not making. So I'm glad that I emphasized I'm not making an essentialist argument. So we can disagree about whether or not what I'm arguing is actually essentialist. But I liked, Nathan, what you said, that this might be an unhelpful truth. And the way that I see my role is, look, I have to be faithful to what I find, even if it leads to outcomes that I'm not comfortable with. And I think that's part of what doing research is about. So it may be an unhelpful truth, and I acknowledge that it can and will be misused. But I also don't want to leave the platform for public debate to people who state the obvious. So I think a lot of Americans look at what they see on the news and they say, of course Islam plays an outsized role in public life. Of course ISIS has something to do with Islam. We can debate what that something is. So I worry that if we engage too much in Islamic apologetics and try to say Islam can be anything and Islam has an endless capacity to be totally liberal like everything else, we are not being honest, and we are ceding the territory to those who are making a more convincing argument because it's right there in our face. And I think that actually is the most dangerous thing that we can do in the era of Trump. So that's how I see it from my perspective. And I agree, just a couple quick things that were brought up is that on this issue of the separation of church and state, I actually emphasize that quite a bit in the book. I say that Islam does have a rich history of the separation of caliph from cleric. In other words, the clerical class was semi-autonomous. They had some independence from the quote-unquote state. Separation of church and state is not the same thing as the separation of religion from politics. And I think that's actually one of the key things I hope people come away. We use the word secularism. That's not actually the part of it that I'm talking about. Because of course, even the Muslim Brotherhood would argue quite passionately for separating Al-Azhar from the Egyptian nation state. So it's actually Islamists who are making the more passionate arguments for separation of church and state than non-Islamists. And I'll just end on this point that Hassan, I take your point that it might actually seem like I'm giving credence to the Islamist narrative. But like I said, it's not just Islamists who are making this argument. It's secular parties who are making the very argument that I'm making. They say we are not secular, at least in the countries that I focus on in the book, but even a number of other countries. We are not secular. They're even uncomfortable, particularly in a country like Egypt, with using the word liberal. But they say that we disagree profoundly with the Muslim Brotherhood. We disagree with Islamists, and we, in some cases, hate them and want to see them killed. But we do believe that Islam has an important role to play in public life. But within that starting point, that Islam should play a prominent role in public life, there is an endless diversity. And I think it's a very vast and open space in terms of varying interpretations. But that starting point, to me, seems pretty fixed and solid in terms of how we see different parties talking about the role that Islam plays. And this, again, is why I think Malaysia and Indonesia are very interesting, because that's precisely what the secular ruling parties in both countries argue. They would not say that it's only Islamists who are saying this. They would say it's we secularists who are also making this argument. So hopefully that can help a little bit, and I'll just close. And it's interesting that a couple of you mentioned Shahab Ahmed, and I draw on his work in my book, and I cite him. He has a very interesting quote that I think is relevant to this conversation, and it's a wonderful book. It's called "What is Islam?" ? The Importance of Being Islamic. It's a wonderful work, and he has a very interesting quote where he says, "Islam has, if I recall, Islam has division of labor, but not necessarily division of product," which I think is a very interesting way of looking at the separation of the clerical class from the state But still, they are aspiring to the same goal of finding a way to implement or understand Islam's role in public and political life. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
I think that, you know, the kind of distinction that you're drawing between division of labor and product and between Islam and the West, undoubtedly Islam is important, whether it's, you know, to people who are Islamist or to people who are secular like myself, right? Islam is important. It's constitutive of identity and of culture, and certainly has a role to play in public and political discourse. But it's not two things. The Quran does not really speak to politics, and Sharia, therefore, is something that has no political content. It is comprised of rules and regulations that have to do with worship, ibadat, and then there are rules and regulations that have to do with civil society matters, muamalat. And this is why when Islamists came to power, for example, in Egypt, in November of 2012, they spent a few months debating the marriage age while the country was falling apart.
The Muslim Brotherhood did not. It was Salafis, just to be clear on that. Yeah.
But at the end of the day,
let me pick up on something that you're saying.
There is one last thing I wanted to say about the difference between Islam and the West, or the Christian West. The Holy Roman Empire is the West's caliphate.
There was an implementation of Christian law in the same way we talk about the implementation of Islamic law, because there isn't something called Christian law.
Islamic law was implemented outside the state sphere. The state itself implemented its own siyasa.
Which fell under. Well, I'll let others jump in.
Actually, you know, just to tie into that, actually, if I am to note a certain exceptionalism in the world, it would be in the Christian West, with natural law being effectively jettisoned out of the religious domain into a supra-domain that effectively governed both the secular and the religious, while neither in the Chinese context, nor in the Indian context, nor in the Islamic context, or for that matter, even in the Russian context, meaning in the Orthodox, Christian Orthodox context, that did not happen. And therefore, I mean, I fail to see where is the Islamic exceptionalism as opposed to saying, well, there's a natural law exceptionalism in the West. That would have been maybe a stronger argument. You see, but I'd like actually to tie that to something that Sumaya inadvertently maybe used, because I know that she said Sharia is about ibadat and muamalat. Actually, it is not. It's fiqh Sharia that is about. And why is this an important distinction? Because we have moved from the area of fuzziness that is pre-modern to an area of objectivity, between quotation marks, that is modern. And you're right to point that Islamism is a modern phenomenon. Islamism actually is truncated modernity in more ways than one, because it stops in terms of its intent on questioning the elements that it has inherited to that ceiling, glass ceiling or otherwise, that is what you're terming the founding moment. But it's a founding moment for Islamists, not for Muslims. You see, that's the main distinction.
But let me ask you, I mean, I can't think of anyone who would argue with the basic premise that Prophet Muhammad played some political role, that he was the head of an incipient state in Medina. It's factually, I can't think of anyone who disagrees with the fact that this actually happened.
You know who it played a supremely important role for? The Shia.
Absolutely, but
it did not play a role for the Sunnis.
Yes, but actually, Sumaya, if you build upon that, just to answer you here, in the course of the 20th century, there has been a lot of reflection from Muslims and non-Muslims who use Islam as, if you'd like, part of their legacy on the role of all those issues. The left in particular tried to think of the Qaramita, which were dismissed in much of the scholastic literature as being nothing but heretics and marauders. The left tried to use the Qaramita as an activity, as a movement of dissent within Islam in order to question the rigidity of the scholastic foundation. If you do not include the debates that happened within the realm of Islamic thought, but outside of Islamism, in the conversation, you are truncating too. The nationalists tried to reverse the equation of Islam having brought glory to Arabs into saying Arabity has generated Islam, which is part of the glory to Arabs. Okay, all of this is part and parcel of Muslim thought in the 20th century. You've excluded it. Because when I'm reading about the Muslim Brothers, when I'm reading about Nahda and Occupy, it's as if they exist in a vacuum, not debating and using the arguments and the tools of the others who are as Muslim as they are.
But Hassan, secularists don't disagree that Prophet Muhammad played a political role. They just find ways to get around it. And even the people who I talk about in the book, some of the most prominent secular reformers, people like Mahmoud Muhammad Taha, and a lot of progressive scholars draw on this, at least implicit distinction between verses that were revealed in Mecca and Medina. Mahmoud Muhammad Taha acknowledges that the Quran does have something to say about law and politics. He just says that those parts of the Quran are no longer applicable to the modern era. And a lot of other people make that kind of implicit distinction.
I'm asking you to widen the field to include people like Hisham Jaid, for example, who would say, we don't know there was a Muhammad.
Okay, but that's not going to gain... Okay, yeah.
What I wanted to do was, again, just... I'm worried about something important that Shadi has said getting lost here. I think on the sort of history and the nature of Islam, the panelists weighed in 3-1, right? But so maybe now it's time to turn it over to the audience. But I actually do worry about a very valuable contribution that will get lost if it's conceived only in that terms. And that is essentially what Shadi's message, I think, is that these are the real ideas that are being debated right now in parts of the Muslim world. And if you're going to be dealing with real Muslims in real Islamic societies, that's who you're dealing with. Whether or not, how they're anchored within the Islamic tradition, and in fact, you show that they're very modern in some ways. But so I recently looked at how it was that two of the most influential liberal philosophers we have around today, the late John Rawls in sort of the Anglo-American tradition, and Jürgen Habermas in the Continental, deal with Islam. And they deal with it in the context of religion. They first come to the issue of religion basically through Christians and then through Muslims. And the interesting thing is, these incredibly erudite people, these people that you really have to read a sentence 5 times before you're sure if you got it, and then you read the next sentence, figure out you didn't get it right, don't talk to real Muslims. They're not in the footnotes, or maybe 1 or 2. And so the entire attempt to grapple I would say within a liberal secular tradition, the entire attempt to grapple with Islam very quickly gets into, here is what Muslims have to say and think before we will talk to them. And Shadi, you're in a sense saying, no, we have to start the other way. I don't know if this is what Islam is. I'm not a Muslim, it's not my job to say. But if you take the argument, here is what these Muslims say, then I think you're making a very, very important point, and one that I think has policy implications that are an awful lot more helpful than simply informing the Muslim world you need a reformation.
I'm with him.
I totally agree with that as well, so I think that's some consensus there.
Should we then open it up to the audience? Yes. I think we might have a roving microphone somewhere. Yeah?
Thank you very much. My name is Raghubir.
Please just make sure you limit your contribution to a question rather than a comment.
I'm Raghubir Goyal. I'm a journalist in Washington. My question is that it takes money and arms to kill innocent people. Who is financing and arming the ISILs? And second, you think the Arabs and Muslim nations are doing enough? And finally, on Friday, State Department will have a timely discussion on this issue, religious and minority ethnics under ISILs. What message do you have for them, you think? Thank you.
Do you want me to?
No.
Oh, okay. That's a little bit of a different discussion. I don't know what I'm not sure exactly what you're suggesting. You can probably guess that I don't buy into conspiracy theories about various powers funding and supporting ISIS Now, there are certainly individuals in the various Gulf countries who support ISIS, but we should separate between private individuals and the actual governments in question. Are Muslims doing enough to fight terrorism? So it's actually interesting you mentioned that, because Bill Clinton last night in his very long but quite interesting speech, which never ended, had a very interesting line which I think a lot of people missed. I think it was the most problematic part of the entire speech. No one cares though, but he said something like, if Muslims.
Yeah, he was conditional.
Yeah, if you are a Muslim and you want to fight terrorism, and then you are welcome. Almost making a kind of point about conditional citizenship, that you can't be fully American and Muslim if you're not going out, speaking out and condemning terrorism and all of that. I have a problem with this idea that Muslims, by virtue of being born Muslim, then have this kind of communal responsibility that all of us as individuals, whenever there's a terrorist attack, we have to go and do a condemnation. I don't want to be put in that position. And some people expect that from me. And they're like, Shadi, you're tweeting about a bunch of other things. Why didn't you tweet a condemnation about the latest terror attack? As if there's this kind of presumption that I have to offer a disclaimer every time I talk about anything else. I think it's a very dangerous thing to argue. So I'm very much against that approach.
We have a question there, and then.
Yes, thank you. My name is Mohammed Abdullah from the Syria Justice and Accountability Center. I have two quick questions. When comparing Egypt to Turkey, where Turkey has a clear identity, nationalist identity that prevailed everything, you see the practice of Islam and Islamism and the religious role in the state much more limited than Egypt, where there's identity crisis. Can you put some comments on the identity crisis in the Middle East and the role of Islam of evolving, supporting or denouncing this identity? And the second question is regarding ISIL, which you didn't touch on the book, neither Hassan or Nathan. The people who are against ISIS, but from Islamist background, saying, oh, we want khilafah, but this one is wrong. There's another better khilafah that fits with us and in line with modern law and Sharia and in line with the human rights and modern liberties. The point is nobody is denouncing the fact or rejecting the idea of Khilafah should be existed today and countries should be ruled based on Sharia laws. Thanks.
Okay, so on the Egypt versus Turkey, I think it's a very interesting contrast, and you're suggesting that Turkey in some ways is more promising because there's a more agreed upon national identity. In my own field research, I kind of came to a different conclusion. I'm actually less, in some ways, quite pessimistic about Turkey, and I think recent events might support that pessimism. But I think one thing that struck me in kind of spending time with current and former AK Party figures, not all of them, but some of them, it was very striking to me because as someone who spent more time with Jordanian, Egyptian, and Tunisian Islamists, they all usually in those three countries, they offer a lot of pretense. Oh, we want to cooperate with liberals and secularists. We like cooperation, pluralism, a lot of nice talk. We can disagree about how sincere that is, but they at least feel the need to pretend, which I think is important on its own, right? What I found with some AK Party figures, at least off the record with me, and I cite them in the book, they say pretty straight up, we hate secularists, and we want to carry Ataturk to his grave, and we will never stop until Ataturk is done. And those are that kind of bitterness is not something I saw at quite the same level in various Arab countries. There was almost a sense, because for them it was very personal and as recent as things that have just happened 2 years ago, where one senior advisor to Davutoglu, who I spoke to, he said essentially that his wife couldn't work at a state hospital as recently as 2013. So for him, it's raw, it's personal, and this is why I think that AK Party figures, they're so intent on capturing the state. They're obsessed with the nation state. So contrary to what a lot of people say that Islamists are against the nation state, I think Islamists oftentimes are too much in the opposite direction. They're in love with the nation state, with the power of it, with its centralization. So essentially what the AK Party, I feel, wants to do is capture the state and use the state as an engine for transforming society. And that to me, and they'll have the chance to do that if Erdogan is able to stay in power, so it'll be a fascinating but also maybe in some ways frightening test case. On the caliphate, maybe you, both of you have points on the caliphate or on the Ak Party, but on the caliphate, look, this is also where I think there might be some disagreement. So whatever the historical reality of the caliphate, how symbolic was it, how real was it, and all of that, the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of Muslims throughout the world today that sort of have the same approach that you do, and the public opinion poll. No, sorry, sorry. I should have said the view that you're expressing, not the one that you have, but you were saying that there are Muslims who express this view, right? Yeah. So the public opinion polling is pretty clear on this, that there is considerable support for the idea of a caliphate, not obviously ISIS's version. But I think for a lot of people, the caliphate isn't really something they understand very well, but it's this idea that, hey, we used to be the greatest civilization the world had ever seen, the Abbasid Caliphate, Ottoman Caliphate, Umayyad Caliphate. That was when the glory was.
Fatimid Caliphate.
Fatimid Caliphate. Thank you. So I think we have to acknowledge that there is a historical resonance when you say the word caliphate. Again, maybe Islam shouldn't be that way, and we can disagree about what Islam actually was at some point in the past. But I have to be realistic, especially as someone who works at a think tank. I got to look at the world as it is, not as I want it to be, right? And it's very clear to me what I see in large swaths of the Muslim majority world, that words like caliphate do continue to have a resonance,
Can I
right?
just add to that the people who are most responsible for bringing caliphate back into circulation as a wonderful idea were Christian Arab proponents of Arab glory, who resurrected, individuals like Georges Zaidan, who resurrected the Islamic past as evidence of Arab glory and put into circulation and into national curricula this idea that the caliphate represented a high watermark, not just for Islam, but for Oruba, right? And I really think you need to investigate how Salafi ideas about the caliphate or the state really come right out of a secular nationalist discourse.
Actually, I think it's important with regard to notions such as the caliphate, not to. I mean, this is something that we've mentioned before. I mean, the whole notion that a poll has the binary power to it. You're either with or against. So but as a matter of fact, the notion of the caliphate is a very diffuse notion that if faced with the choice of plus or minus, people may choose plus. But if given the freedom to choose 10 topics, it might not figure. 100 topics, it might not figure. So there's a misleading, and this is, I go back to the whole notion, and this is why at one point I termed the talk about Islamic exceptionalism, although I suspect you wanted Islamist exceptionalism, and you did not?
No. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. But the reason I find it to be dangerous is because there's the feedback effect to it, along the lines that the audiences that we as think tank individuals we're trying to analyze and understand are not distant from us, actually very much so. Islamist and non-Islamist follow very clearly what is said in the West. And I mentioned about already what I call an unholy alliance between Western scholarship and Islamic scholasticism. Okay, but actually there's another feedback loop here at play, which we see it by, for example, the Islamic State quoting Trump, but actually we see it also by the fact that when we say that there is Islamic exceptionalism and we say we're just observing facts, actually we're influencing a conversation. This is not just a matter of a hard truth, because actually I think that, as I said, and we can debate that for hours, I don't think that you made the case. I think that you stipulated the case that there's exceptionalism, and therefore, but what is going to be extracted from your work is that the case has been made.
Yeah.
And this actually will kind of, I think, tie into what you're talking about, and I'd like to get your reactions to a couple of things. I've worked in the Middle East for 3 decades plus. And it struck me when in discussions and the relationship between, let me get to the broader point, Ummah, nation state, caliphate. Because in listening to people talk, and I'm talking about educated leaders Arab leaders, Muslim leaders, one in a private conversation with American leaders said, almost in jest, he said, but we've accepted the prophets and Christ, why don't you accept Muhammad? It's the next step. Listening to Steve Inskeep several years back interviewing Prince Rod on NPR, who he asked explicitly about the caliphate. And I think a modern Christian will say something like, the kingdom of God is within us. Christ said, render unto Caesar what's Caesar's, what's to God's, what's God. And the kingdom of God, rather than being a militant, onward Christian soldiers thing, is within your heart, kind of the jihad, the PC concept of jihad. But then and Rod said exactly the answer, the description there. The caliphate, rather than rejecting the idea or what ISIL was doing or anything else, or Daesh, he said the caliphate is a concept that remains very dear to Muslims, very near to us, but we are not ready for it yet. The time is not right for it yet. Now the third comment I'll mention from a friend, and then I'd love to hear the reactions, was, and this is a modern, Fulbright, PhD Turkish Muslim who said, Deborah, at some point you will be drawn to Kaaba as instinctively and naturally as animals in the Sahara make their way, their migratory tracks. So what's the relationship then there? Is it a proselytizing? Are we coming to this end? And also, if you're a young Muslim man in Belgium and you're part of the Ummah, but you're cut out from the wealth of the nation states, but use Islam as a supportive foundation, how do you square that circle?
I think we talk in the West about, as Nathan showed in the quote that he read from the Republican Convention, we may not have an institution called the Caliphate, but we have this thing called Judeo-Christian values and Western civilization, and we're constantly talking about it as not only this framework that creates a communitas, if you will, for us, an ummah for us, but also that is meant to inform, the political institutions under which we live. Maybe it's just a question of semantics, maybe it's just a question of terminology, and I think, at the end of the day, there is a certain evangelical aspirational, as you were saying, Shadi, this presumption that Muslims will eventually see the light and become more like us. Well, a lot of Muslims think that, non-Muslims will eventually see the light and, how can you not? But go with the new and improved monotheism that is Assad. We have a question here and a question there.
Thank you very much. Shadi, you mentioned you see things as they are in one of your sentences. What we see in this country is we're scared to death of Islam because of what we see in the Middle East, we see what the governments are, and now, of course, Trump, who's, I think, the most dangerous character since perhaps somebody in the 30s, I shall remain nameless, in Germany. This guy scares the hell out of us, especially those of us who are from the Holocaust generation. So how do you convince the United States? I would say, and maybe you agree with me, that most people are ignorant of Islam. And if you're ignorant of something, you're scared of it. I see it in many places. How do you convince us that this is a peaceful religion, that this is a religion of compromise, this is a peaceful, and the friends that we have are all peaceful. But what we see in CNN and everything else is a very violent situation. And Americans are scared to death of that. And you see it when you see in Trump's rallies. You see it. So what do we need to do? And I would just preface that. The title of your book is a problem. Because when I saw exceptionalism, I say exceptionalism is up here, and we who are Judeo-Christians are below that. And I think that's a very dangerous way to entitle it. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So first of all, I would say I'm actually not comfortable calling Islam a religion of peace. I'm not comfortable calling it a religion of violence. I think it's somewhere in between. And again, this is where I do get in disagreements, including with many of my Muslim friends and colleagues, who whenever there's an attack, they want to do whatever they can to disassociate Islam, something that's very dear to them, understandably, from whatever ISIS is doing. I'm sorry, I can't do that as an analyst. I don't think that is intellectually honest to say, so after I think one of the attacks in France, I was hearing a lot of this from my Muslim friends. Islam has nothing to do with ISIS. So I wrote a piece which essentially in the title it was like, Islam has something to do with ISIS, it's just a question of what that something is, right? And obviously I think personally as an American Muslim that ISIS has taken a very minoritarian, perverted version of the religion. So of course, the overwhelming majority of Muslims oppose ISIS and will, right? But at the same time, to say that religion has nothing to do with this, again, I think it's counterproductive, and it leaves the space open to Trump supporters who say, look at all those, fluffy liberal apologists in Washington, New York, who want to pretend that religion has nothing to do with anything. Part of what I want to do in this book is bring back religion as an explanatory factor. I mean, religion matters. Religion affects people. It's not just politics, power, economic interest. People are poor, so they join an Islamist movement. I feel like whenever there's an attack, we want to say that it's always religion, at least liberal elites like us, whatever. We want to always separate Islam. I just don't think that's the right approach. In terms of so part of it is acknowledging that there are differences, and we should be able as a nation to respect that we're not all the same. To me, that's what America is about: Orthodox Jewish communities, Christian evangelical communities. I can disagree with them profoundly, but I should accept that and respect that level of difference without casting them out of the American fold. I think also knowing real life Muslims helps. And I mean, that could be a start, right?
There you go.
Talk to us, whatever. So I think that, let's.
Let me
And then we
actually-
we had a question from back there, but you did get your microphone. Okay, so then this and that.
I want to underline a disagreement I have with Shadi on here. If a Muslim says that Islam has nothing to do with ISIS, I would never put myself in a position to tell him, no, you're wrong. Tell him that's your understanding of it. Others have different understandings. I go back to the whole notion that, yes, indeed, I do accuse Shadi of essentialism. Islam as a living religion, Muslims as practitioners of a living religion have the right to voice their convictions about this religion that they're shaping, because it is theirs, without someone telling them, but this is contradictory to the essence of Islam. It's fair to say that's your interpretation of it, and ISIS has a different interpretation, and the challenge for you is to prove to yourself and to others that these interpretations are different.
Hassan, to be fair, that's exactly what I just said, that the overwhelming majority of Muslims disagree with ISIS. So I'll be the first one to acknowledge that as Muslims understand Islam, as the vast majority of them understand Islam, they see ISIS as being outside the fold. But what I'm saying is that ISIS is inspired by its own understanding of religion, and we can't discount that. And we can't say, oh, they're under false consciousness, or they're just using religion,
No.
or they're just Ba'athists in disguise.
ISIS is Islamic the same way these other versions are Islamic. But it is not that you cannot, meaning we are not, I mean, if you're a Muslim and who thinks that this is contrary to Islam, I mean, it's almost offensive.
But I have a right to disagree with that assessment as an analyst, right?
That's exactly it.
Next question, I'm sorry.
Thanks. I just want to pick up on this exceptionalism idea. And you talked about Christianity and Islam, but I'm wondering if you guys could throw in your 2 cents about how Judaism compares to that. I in many ways think it's closer to Islam, and I think Reza Aslan picks up on that as well in his book.
Okay, so I actually have a brief section on Judaism in chapter 2, so that might be of interest. But I think I would just say very briefly that there are more interesting, I think, comparisons when it comes to the legal perspective with Judaism. But there are, again, I think, important differences that since the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, Jews have been living as minorities under the rule of others. So for the better part of 2,000 years, they haven't been in a position to govern their own states. Of course, the creation of Israel changes that, but that's fairly recent. So the rabbinical tradition evolves in a certain way, really from 70 AD onwards, in a particular direction that's more focused on the community and how to live as a Jewish community under majority rule of other religions. So that affects, again, that's why I would argue that I'm not making an essentialist argument, because history matters and how religions interact with their historical context at any given time. So if the destruction of the Second Temple didn't happen, perhaps Judaism would look different today, right? So I think that there's a lot of different courses these religions could have taken, but history happened.
Khazar Empire and Himyarite Yemen as exceptions for that, naturally. Yeah.
Munjid Awadi from the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. Congratulations, what a great conversation. We could listen to you guys for hours. Two quick things, and I hope you can comment on them. One, what do you think the damage was done in terms of the lack of this kind of conversation within, especially the Arab world, within the last decades? There was no discussion about Islamism, real discussion in the open because of lack of freedom, lack of exchange of ideas, if you will. Most of the Islamic movements have dealt with the state or dealt with the rest of is through the jails. They're most of the time they were in jails or in exile. So there was no real debate, real discussion about these ideas. The second point is, what is your take on what Nahda is doing in Tunisia in terms of pushing the idea of separation of religion or politics or religion and what they call the specialty of practicing politics versus practicing da'wah or Islam?
So I think that you bring up a really good point, that part of the reason you actually don't have many conversations like this, at least in a number of Arab countries today. And that's why a prerequisite for really anything positive to happen is more, I don't even want to use the word democracy because it's a continuum, but at least more political opening. At least to have it moving in the trajectory of more freedoms, not less, when oftentimes in the region it's going in a very negative direction. And this is why I also think this idea that, and often, let's be honest, small L, people who call themselves liberals, at least in some Arab countries, have been quite vocal at times in supporting autocratic regimes. So-called secularists have been very vocal in supporting autocratic regimes. And this is why I worry that the discourse that Muslims have to be liberal or secular, it actually feeds into the autocratic narrative that Muslims can't be trusted to vote because they'll vote for Islamically oriented parties. We have to force them to get on board with modernity. And we've seen how that's worked out. On a Nahda, I would say, so it's interesting you mentioned Nahda because actually the Tunisia chapter in my book is titled Tunisia, Islamists conceding their Islamism. And that seems to be part of what they're doing, although I problematize it a little bit in the chapter. And they have tried to move in this direction of separating the movement from the party, or haraka from hizb, right? In other words, the political activities from the religious activities. This is not the same as secularism, though. It's just a separation of, so Ennahda as a party should be focusing on politics, and other civil society organizations can focus on the da'wah or religious education or preaching aspects of the message. And a lot of Islamist movements, I'm sure, Nathan, you have some ideas on this, have talked more and more, including the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood in exile. There are some very interesting internal conversations happening now about what is the relationship between the movement and the party, where some prominent leaders have been talking about when there's a political opening in Egypt, that you wouldn't have one brotherhood party, you would have maybe 3 or 4 different Islamist parties, and anyone who's a Muslim Brotherhood member could then be free to choose what party they want to join. I think there's some problems with that in practice, because then you'd have Muslim Brotherhood members competing against each other for parliamentary seats, and I don't know if they've really gamed out those scenarios and how that would affect the internal discipline of the movement, but at least more people are having that conversation.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Stanley Kober, I'm an MEI member. I'd like to pursue this Holy Roman Empire versus the Caliphate. Both disappeared, they disintegrated. And there have been efforts to recreate both, you could say. The EU as possibly a successor to the Holy Roman Empire with the European identity. But that seems now to be in trouble. We have the growth of nationalism, even the transatlantic identity with a presidential candidate questioning NATO. But at the same time, you have this growing emphasis on the caliphate focused on the Islamic identity as opposed to the nation state, what we're seeing, the rejection of Sykes-Picot and all of that. And I'm struck by the contrast. And I'm wondering if members of the panel could address that.
Okay, I'll start on that. So it's interesting that you mentioned the EU as a model, because actually some Islamists, when they talk about their support for a caliphate, they'll qualify it by saying, What they really mean is something like the EU. So it's interesting that you sort of drew that comparison. It's not just Islamists, not to put it, but so I think that you're getting at a bigger issue, I think, which is I also have my own starting biases like anyone else does in terms of how I look at the word from a philosophical standpoint. And I believe that every society needs to have at least some set of unifying norms and ideas that bind citizens together. That's part of what nationalism is supposed to do for the nation state. But we don't agree now, at least in some countries, about what nationalism really means. So I would say, and Democrats in this country would say, they believe in the American nation, they're patriotic, but Republicans would say that they're patriotic, but these are very different conceptions of what it means to be American, right? So I think the question is, it's a question that any society has to contend with. What do we believe in beyond unfettered individualism? So liberalism, I think, is great for a lot of us liberal elites, but what we're finding throughout the US and Europe is that a lot of people are saying that's not enough. They want something more, whether it's communitarianism, whether it's different kind of models that focus less on the individual and more on society writ large. Obviously, evangelicals want Christianity to play a more binding role in society. So I think that's essentially part of what many of these Muslim majority countries are contending with. And I think that in, say, France, religion is not going to provide that glue or that binding mechanism. I think in many Arab and Muslim majority countries, the natural setting that people fall back on when they're looking for meaning and identity will have some religious component, even if it's mixed with nationalism and so on. So I think in some ways, that is the question of our time, really, right? And that's also why I'm not super optimistic about the West either. But
I mean, I think also there's this question of the crisis of the nation state. The nation state has been limping along for a while. It suffered challenges, according to some pundits, from globalization. It suffered challenges from the, warring groups and tribalism or what have you, Balkanization, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, part of the conversation or part of the sort of wondering about whither we go often includes these sort of larger forms of community. There's a nostalgia for certain kinds of empire, for federated unions, whether you call them EU, the Holy Roman Empire, the Caliphate, and I think they're part of the same phenomenon.
It's a question of the moment in time. I mean, if we look at Islamism today as part of a process that just to go back just 200 years, not beyond that, we can note that the Middle East experienced an exposure to ideas that came from the French Revolution. Actually, the manifestation of those ideas in the regions were multiple. But in any case, that absorption had also a top-down aspect to it, with the intellectual elites basically proposing a notion of modernity that's progress-oriented, that's freedom-oriented, that is equality-oriented. Now, that promise coincided, if you'd like, with the end of the First World War, the collapse of the old empire-based system and the emergence of nation-state system. If you look since, what you have is promises and the failure of these promises. So modernity, liberal modernity failed. In the Middle East, I'm talking. Nationalism, which is a retrenchment to, if you'd like, a local identity, came as a counter, if you'd like, counter proposition. It failed, with Palestine being lost from the perspective of the region, etc. So what came is another global perspective, which is international leftism, meaning international revolution. It too failed. So Islamism is the fourth iteration in a process almost of oscillation between global, open, and then authentic, if you'd like. And at this point, Islamism seems to be faltering and trying to fail, but actually being able not to fail as a result of maneuvers. But as a program, it too is not actually faring very well. So rather than view it in terms of the organic, innate character of the population, if you view it in terms of the historical cycle, this is maybe from the moment in time.
We have time for one more question, very quickly.
Okay, we've been talking an awful lot about Sunni Islamism. in the beginning of your book, you eliminate any discussion of Iran because you don't want to talk about the marja'at taqlid and the way that it is new and interesting. But Shia Islam is old and rich and far beyond Iran. Can you talk a little bit about your ideas here in regard to the body that is Shia Islam?
Sure. So, so in the book, I have a particular focus, and I have to be honest. I can't cover everything in a book. So there are certain things that I had to say. Well, hey, other people can do this better than I can. I'm not an I haven't spent much time studying Shia Islamic theology or philosophy. I have not done field work in Shia majority countries, so I don't feel I'm very qualified to make. To kind of give the a final word or a word even on where Iran fits into all of this. I mean, that said, I mean, Iran, I hope that other scholars can sort of engage with my argument and say, well, how does this apply to the Shia world? And what can we learn if we look at it from a comparative perspective? But certainly I felt that the comparison didn't work for what I wanted to do, because we're talking, first of all, about a different clerical structure. And I think what's distinctive about Sunni Islam, at least in some ways, is that its clerical structure is quite different, not just from what Iran has now become, let's say, but also from how it was, say, 4 or 5 centuries ago in Christian Europe, where the Reformation is in part a response and reaction to clerical despotism. Clerical despotism has not been as much of a problem in the Sunni majority parts of the. No, that's what I argue. That's my
Well,
people don't have to agree with that.
Can I just?
But look, I mean, at the end of the day, I didn't write this book for everyone to agree with me. In fact, I hope it would be suspicious if people agreed with most of it or 100% of it. What I want this book to do is to challenge assumptions and to make people slightly uncomfortable. It made me slightly uncomfortable. So look, I should say thank you to Hassan Mneimneh and Sumaya for challenging me. And this has been, I think, a fun and different conversation, because usually you don't have as much. This is what I think think tank debates should have more of. So I'm happy that we were able to have this.
Can I just say, on the point of the Iranian Revolution, I wish you had gone into it more, because
you wish I had or hadn't? Had. Okay.
Because despite the so-called difference between Sunni and Shia Islam, were it not for the Islamic Revolution in 1979, which, by the way, the entire Sunni world was amazed by,
Welcomed.
there would have been less of a desire to pursue a similar path. The Islamic Revolution in Iran, for all that it was Shia in origin, created a template, if not model, for the Sunni Islamists. And for that reason,
that's a different book. That's a different book.
For that reason, you should have gone into it. But I think that, at the end of the day, Shia Islam, as Shadi was saying, has a very different kind of clerical landscape. But to the extent that religion and politics in Islam works, it works in Shia Islam because of this one very important thing, which is ijtihad, which has enabled Shia Islam to constantly adapt and evolve and respond to politics in a way that Sunni Islam does not have the ability to. So I would like to say that whereas, Sharia is something that Sunni Islamist groups talk about, there's really no there when it comes to governance and politics in the state. Capturing the state is one thing. What to do with it and how to Islamize it is something that Sunni Islamists are going to have a hard time doing in a way that Shia don't. Thank you very much. Sorry.